We're now near the intersection of Central Avenue and Alabama Street. Alabama Street is what has been developed into the underground Atlanta Mall. And to my left is the location of the 0 mile post in the shadows there. Behind me are the MARTA tracks, our transit system, and then immediately parallel to those are the railroad tracks of the old Georgia Railroad, which from here goes east to Augusta. And that parking structure behind me is the location where Union Station was built. The first one was built in 1853. It was a pretty simple open-air structure, really just a series of brick arches and a long vaulted shed roof. And it was also known as the train shed. And it was called Union Station because it served several railroads, all the railroads that came into the city. It was the passenger station. There were also, each railroad had its own locations for distributing freight. So near us is the historic Georgia Railroad Freight Depot, which served the freight for that railroad. So the Union Station that was built in 1853 was destroyed in the Civil War by Sherman, and it was rebuilt in 1871 on the same location. Also a long open vaulted building, but this one had some cast iron detailing and sort of a Second Empire or Victorian style to it. Had some towers on the ends, and the ends of the vaulted roof had a very distinctive almost flower petal shape to them that doesn't really have any architectural precedent, but it's reminiscent of the housings that would have been on the side of paddle wheel riverboats, oddly enough. And so that structure stood until 1930, when it was replaced by our third Union Station a few blocks to the west of us. And also behind me was the Kimball House, which was our most prominent hotel, and of course built right adjacent to the passenger station. And it was a large, also Victorian style structure that had a lot of early technological innovations, and it was really one of the fanciest hotels in the South. Here you can, with the MARTA tracks and the railroad tracks behind me, you can start to get an idea of what became known as the Railroad Gulch. So of course that where that parking structure is behind me was a passenger station with, I think, about half a dozen parallel railroad tracks, and this is all running parallel between Alabama Street and Wall Street. So it was basically an intense industrial railroad junction right in the middle of downtown. And from our modern point of view, we think of industrial functions as completely anathema to what we expect in the core of our city. But actually most American cities were built around large industrial facilities. So it made sense in that respect, but from early on they did realize that especially the long trains basically parked here were, if nothing else, blocking any flow of traffic north and south. And so from an early point, as early as the 1870s, they started building bridges across these tracks, originally along Broad Street, which was higher than the tracks. Starting with a pedestrian bridge, and then that was upgraded to a vehicular bridge, trying to separate the railroad traffic from the pedestrian and vehicular traffic so that it didn't block up the trade. And then also these locomotives got bigger and bigger and smellier and dirtier and more, frankly, more dangerous. It was in the 1930s when the city decided to build a series of bridges or viaducts spanning over the tracks to alleviate this. And not only did they do that, but the two parallel streets, Alabama Street and Wall Street, were also raised up to the bridge level, basically to connect the series of parallel bridges. And that effectively created an elevated street grid. And another thing that helps them read more as streets than as bridges is that they were built right up against the existing buildings, and as new buildings have been built as infill, they've also been built right up against the new streets. And so when you're at the top level, you really don't get a sense that you're not still on the ground. It's actually pretty hard to tell where the grade is going and when you're up onto an elevated street. So what happened was the structures that were in place when the viaducts were built in the 1930s had to actually relocate their main entrances to the second floor level to address the new street at the top of the bridge, and everything below that became a service zone, and that kind of got abandoned and really forgotten about over the years. And that's the area, especially along Lower Alabama Street, that was sort of rediscovered in a sense in the 1970s and became kind of a nightclub district. And by that time, a number of the buildings had been abandoned or even demolished in their upper floors, but the portions of the structures that were left below the viaduct still dated back either to the 1920s or even earlier. Unfortunately, 2 whole blocks of that district were actually right about where we're standing, and when the MARTA transit system was built in the 1980s, they had to take out 2 blocks of historic structures to get those tracks in parallel to the original freight railroad. Talking about the viaducts, despite the name Underground, there really are no parts of Atlanta that are literally underground, other than some basements and bank vaults. The terrain here is actually mostly flat, and the bridges are spanning up and over it. But because our city is a little bit hilly, these bridges just look like hills to us. So this area along Alabama Street had kind of a heyday in the 1970s as this funky jazz club destination. And of course a lot of its charm was the fact that it was run down and dark and out of the way. But as you might expect, all those characteristics led to it becoming more run down, and there were issues with crime and drugs and things like that. So by sometime in the 1980s, it became very problematic, and so the area was redeveloped into really a sort of tourist-oriented shopping mall by the same corporation, I think, that was doing things like this in Baltimore and New Orleans and things like that. So now what we see is a place that is, first of all, enclosed. It used to be that you would be able to walk freely from the streets at grade and into the Lower Alabama Street and walk around and across the railroad tracks. And now, of course, they've added doors and storefront, things like that. So there's no continuity between the inside and the out. A lot of the historic storefronts are still in there. but then they've also infilled with new construction from the 1980s, and most people with a trained architectural eye can easily spot what's new and what's old, but for the general tourist it's probably not that obvious. So you have to have kind of a keen eye to really spot what's new and what's old. But at the same time, you start to become aware that you're on a street, there's curbs and gutters, and you look up and you've got the underside of a city bridge with utilities running overhead and things like that. The old cobblestones were replaced, and so there's been a fair amount that has been lost, but it's still one of our major tourist destinations. We are standing beneath the Spring Street Viaduct, which was built in 1923, and we are really above the Railroad Gulch area. Marietta Street is behind me, and the old headquarters of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution newspaper. When you look at old maps or aerial views of this part of Atlanta, there's always this distinctive triangular railroad junction. That was the connection of the original 3 railroads that join in this triangle that the railroads call a Y. And so behind me is the eastern point of that triangle, the triangular railroad junction. So a lot of the open area that you see now as surface parking was all railroad tracks originally, and now that certainly the passenger railroad traffic has declined, most of that, almost all of that has been pulled out. We still do have at least one active track on each leg of that original triangular junction. Back in 1909, there was a guy named Blakely who envisioned that the entire Railroad Gulch would actually be covered over by a grand civic plaza flanked by tall buildings. And this really can be seen as part of the sort of Beaux-Arts City Beautiful movement at the time. It was not long after the expositions at Piedmont Park, and so people were thinking about ways to redesign downtowns and make them more livable and really make them more planned. And so he had this idea of this long linear elevated plaza that was over the railroad tracks that became sort of the focal point of the town. Of course, that never happened. There was a very small city park called Plaza Park that was built in 1949 near what's now underground Atlanta along Peachtree Street. But for the most part, what was built was these viaducts, and the city did have kind of a unified effort between about 1928 and 1936, in which they built a series of 5 or 6 viaducts, elevated streets, spanning over the tracks, perpendicular to the tracks. And then notably, they also raised the 2 parallel streets, Wall Street and Alabama Street. And that created this idea of more of an elevated street grid, so you feel less like you're on a bridge and more like you're on the actual city streets. Also, behind me to my left is where the 3rd Union Station was built in 1930. That was a smaller neoclassical building that was actually up at the elevated street level, and then you would take a series of staircases down to where there were 5 or 6 parallel platforms at the train level.